Pop Pickers. I'm Mylo, and I'm here to talk about my nomination for Mixmag's greatest DJ of all time, which is Optimo from Scotland. I first discovered them as Optimo when I moved back from the States to Glasgow in about 2001, and a few of my friends who were my flatmates were at the Glasgow Art School, and it was this it's just chaotic club every Sunday night, which was largely kind of freaks, unemployed people, artists, art students, and they started taking me along, and I'd never seen such kind of chaos and heard such musical carnage and eclecticism. And this was particularly at a time when the club scene was supposed to be dead, and I think it really encouraged me to get into electronic music, because it was clear to me that that wasn't the case at all. So I think it was a really quite an exciting time around the turn of the last decade. As it turned out, I actually knew of them as DJs individually before. Johnny had a club called Knucklehead in Glasgow, and Keith had a club called Pure in Edinburgh, and they were both very straight up 90s techno nights, and that was kind of my introduction to clubbing. And I think it was clear that they grew out of that and they began to find that boring, and they wanted to do something with much more musical freedom. So Optimo started up without any fanfare at all. I don't think there were even any posters. It was on something like a Tuesday night originally, and there were perhaps 5 people on the first night, and then eventually grew to about 50, and then they moved to their regular Sunday slot. And it just, as a pure word of mouth phenomenon in Glasgow, which isn't really a huge city, it just became an absolute institution. And they never took the temptation of kind of growing it any further, moving it to Friday or Saturday, or moving it to a bigger venue like the Arches, and it stayed true to its founding principles right up until this year, when they officially closed it down. And I think through going there, I mean, I was introduced to so many sounds. I really didn't have much of a clue about the history of dance music when I was going out around that time, but they'd both been DJing for a couple of decades, and they were completely, versed in everything from New York post-punk. There was a big New York kind of feel to the whole sound of the club. The biggest kind of classic tracks for the club were Larry Levan, Celestial Choir, Stand on the Word, and Arthur Russell kind of stuff as well. So there was very much a New York experimental disco feel to it. But it was so funny, as an eclectic club, that it wouldn't always go through the whole gamut of styles in one night, like a kind of car crash. It would change over time. You'd go there one week, it would be a pure, a beautiful kind of dubby disco set, and then the next week it would be pure kind of digital dance hall. And they weren't just doing it to take the piss, they were drawing on actual knowledge of the genres. I mean, anybody could download a top 10 so-called dancehall tracks and play them, but I mean, there's always a sense of drawing on a lot of real knowledge, even of kind of very obscure genres. And it was helped by the fact that Keith was a really early adopter of Ableton as a DJ, whereas Johnny was always a kind of technical vinyl DJ. But they switched between the two quite seamlessly. I think Keith was the first DJ I saw who played with Ableton and made it seem credible, and actually explored the functionalities and the capacities of what you could do with it. So that was, when I eventually got into playing around with Ableton a few years ago, that was a big influence as well. Also, when I first started going there, this was before I'd heard of Errol and Trash, before I'd heard of too many DJs even. But it was interesting, as getting more and more into dance music over the next couple of years, seeing that there seemed to be a similar revolution happening in London and in different parts of Europe as well. And it was nice to feel that Glasgow was in a lot of ways at the forefront of that. And I think, even though in terms of profile, I've no doubt Errol and Too Many DJs are bigger than Optimo currently, but I mean, within the world of DJs, and everyone from the kind of French disco re-edits guys to the German minimal guys, they all know Optimo, they follow them, follow their compilations, and speak of them very highly. So I mean, to use another cliche, they really are DJs. And it's quite a good year for them. I think the club was great up until the end, and they eventually closed it this year, replaced it with a night called Hung Up, which is, I think, a reference to the hung parliament of the May 2010 election, although I don't know if anybody will remember that in a few years' time. But it was also a reference to the Madonna Stuart Price song. I mean, one thing that always surprised me about them is complete willingness to embrace very commercial pop, and it came as a bit of a surprise at first to find out that Hung Up by Madonna was one of their top 10 pop songs of all time, you know, right up there with very obscure things by Arthur Russell or Chris and Cosey and Throbbing Gristle and so on. Speaking of the last two, I mean, like a lot of the DJs on the nominations list, I think they're music fans first and foremost. I'm sure that's something that people said about their other nominees, but I mean, certainly in the case of the Optimo guys, you know, if somebody like Chris and Cosey, or who's touring this week, the Swans, you know, band I'd barely heard of, like really nutty Americans. I mean, they'll get on a flight or a train anywhere to just go and see these bands that most people have never heard of and never would hear of. And so yeah, I mean, being a DJ and running a really successful club is about that enthusiasm, and to still have that when you've been in your kind of third or fourth decade of DJing is pretty amazing. I mean, my interaction with Optimo has always just mainly as a fan and a regular clubber. I remember tracking Keith down at some summer office garden party when I had my first 7-inch with Destroy Rock and Roll with a track called Sunwisher on the B-side, and I gave it to him. I said something like, "Oh, this is going to be like Losing My Edge by LCD Sound System. You have to listen to it, you know." And he just looked at me and was like, "You have no idea." And no doubt he was right. And didn't really speak to him about that again. But you know, eventually got to know them. We don't see them that often, and I live in London now. They're up north, but. When we were doing the Sky Music Festivals in 2006, 2007, we managed to get them up. It was my friend Lewis, who was mainly organising it with his dad, and they obviously got paid, but the thing that really sealed the deal was that he went to a charity auction and bought all this Coronation Street memorabilia, because a little known fact is that the one thing that will get Optimo anywhere is a detritus involved in Coronation Street, so they were pretty thrilled about that. And then, but even, I mean, I've always, they know a hell of a lot more about music than me, and probably have seen my support of them as a bit of a poisoned chalice, truth be told. And definitely when we were playing up in Sky Festival, it was scheduled that we were actually on at the same time, and Sky being Sky, I probably had more of a crowd than them, and Johnny's reaction to that was to say, "Oh well, we're like Newsnight going up against Pop Idol," which pretty piercing analogy, I thought, but fair enough in some respects. I was playing Run Rig records up, so what can I say? Now that they've stopped the weekly night and freed themselves up to travel more and do some new projects, it's quite an exciting year, and we'll see where it ends up. And that is why they are my nomination for the greatest DJs of all time.